سلام. امیدوارم که خوب باشین. خب من سلام میکنم اول بهتون. یک چند دقیقه دیگه، چند دقیقه که نه، تا چند ثانیه دیگه مارکو ریکوست میفرستم که جوین بشه بهمون. خیلی خودم خوشحالم و هیجان زدم بابت این اتفاق، چون خیلی اتفاق عالیه. مرسی از این که دارین اضافه میشین به این لایو. امیدوارم که واقعا لذت ببرین. ما خیلی تلاش کردیم که بهترین کیفیت رو داشته باشه، ولی پیشا پیش اگر که مشکلی پیش اومد ازتون عذرخواهی میکنم. توضیح دیگه هم بدم که از مارکو که کلام حالا به رسم ادب یا هر چیزی که اسمشو میذارین دیگه فارسی نمیتونم صحبت کنم، انگلیسی دست و پا شکسته منم ببخشید. امیدوارم که بتونم در واقع به اندازه کافی خوب چیزایی که مد نظرمونه بپرسم از مارک و برامون صحبت کنم. اگر موافقین شروع کنیم. مارکو ریکوست فرستادن که استاد میکروفون از یقه لباس. چشم. خب waiting for Mark. Hello Mark. Oh yeah, you're here.
I am here.
Hello Mark, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for accepting. It's really a pleasure to have you in our live discussion.
Of course, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Is everything all right? I mean,
other than we had a few flakes of snow earlier, everything's okay. Yes.
But other things like social distancing, hand sanitizer, everything in the place, yeah?
Yes. Well, as you know from your time here in Buffalo, now where I am right now, social distancing has never been a problem.
Great. Mark, do you want to say a quick hi to our audience, and then I go through the questions and discussion? We can start later on.
Sure. No, just hello everyone. Great to be with you today. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're healthy and you're not bored out of your minds. And if you are bored out of your minds, maybe we can help give some interesting discussions. So thank you, Mahan, for the invitation, and really wonderful to be able to see you today. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure. Well, let's start with a quite personal question for you to start the conversation with. Mark Shepard holds a joint agreement with the Department of Architecture and Department of Media Studies. Mark, tell us a little bit about this. Your occupation at the university. How does it work? Media studies and architecture. How is it relevant?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So I started teaching here about 15 years ago, and I was hired in this capacity as a joint appointment between the two departments. They were launching a new program in media architecture, and they were looking for somebody to direct that program. What is media architecture? You might ask. It remains a good question. I think one of the
forever probably.
Yes. Well,
forever probably.
Hopefully.
It's a never-ending question. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, hopefully. That's a really important point, is that, that question became thematized in the way we developed the curriculum for the program, which is to say that we looked at the convergence of physical architectural space and urban space in particular, with a mediatic space or computational media space. So what is the implications of the convergence of mobile, embedded, pervasive media computing and technologies into the urban environment in particular? And what are the corresponding changes that are taking place in the way we think about architecture, the way we design architecture, and the way we think about what it means to be an architect in the first place?
Great. Okay, Mark, I have two sort of questions for you tonight, and I'm happy to hear from you. The first set are as primarily about the relationship between design and technology. I mean, design, art, architecture, and other design disciplines. Um, uh, let's start with the fact that we're witnessing an increasing number of artists and architects experimenting with these new technologies. Um, we have like the let's say democratization of interaction design. We have Arduino platform and processing, I guess since 2007, 2008, and nowadays young teenagers are playing with Raspberry Pis. I mean Linux computers from of 10 years ago. How do you think it's important for young educators to get to know about technologies and to experiment with them? And where do you think this tendency actually comes from?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So, you know, a little bit of historical context. 15 years ago, when I first started teaching people in architecture and design and media art to work with this thing called Arduino,
Mm-hmm.
it was relatively new at that time. People were tending to use, you could program PIC chips, little microcontrollers, and you would spend 3 weeks trying to, you know, first solder a circuit, which then you could plug the chip into and then flash the firmware. So maybe after 3 weeks of effort, you could get an LED to blink, right?
Yeah,
And that was
3 weeks.
there was 3 weeks. You know, with the Arduino, everything changed, and it was really, I think, a change in focus and attention as anything else. These platforms are all based on higher levels of interpretation. So the higher order um, processes of interpretation that you're able to engage in translate to an interface. You have a interface which enables you to write code, which then is enabling an LED to blink. Rather than having to handle some of the lower level memory management issues or having to deal with the kind of assignments of and configuration, the parameters for, say, like an analog digital converter, Arduino and platforms like it made these technologies more accessible to artists and designers by simplifying them and creating a kind of community online where people were able to share tutorials, code, exchange, you know, methods of doing things, which were written in and written from the perspective of an artist and a designer, as opposed to a technologist. So I think today it's extremely important to you know, introduce forms of tinkering, ways of playing around with technologies that don't necessarily try to solve problems so much, but maybe create problems. And it's somehow in the problems that we create for ourselves, the messes we get into while we're tinkering around with these technologies, that educators, I think, need to really embrace as ways to engage broader communities in working with technologies in creative ways.
Great. And regarding this topic, to what extent do you think, let's say, architects, urban designers, urban planners, even those working on urban sociology, economy, to what extent should they get to know about these technologies? I'm asking both in terms of semantics and syntax.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Uh, how do you see this?
Well, you know, I think it's absolutely important to understand and to be able to write code. You know, I
Uh-huh.
think that code, you know, is indeed the language of our time. And it's interesting from the perspective of architecture and urban planning, you know, there is this, in English, there is this dual use of the word code, right? In terms of there's computer code and, you know, written instructions which are interpreted by an operating system and, you know, generating actions and events based on that interpretation. And then there's building codes and zoning codes, right? They
Oh
use
yeah.
the same term to describe how an environment is formatted or it's organized, or specific uses which are available, or specifications or standards by which a wall needs to be built to protect against fire transmission, things like this. These are also called code in the kind of English language. And I
It
think
resembles the word standard, like.
yeah, but the fact that the same word is used is, I think, an important kind of connection. We often think that coding itself is something only specialists do, computer scientists, and engineers. But in fact, the most simple algorithms are things you perform in the kitchen on an everyday basis, right? Series of instructions which you follow and interpret. You have a set of inputs and variables, which are your ingredients, and a set of outputs, which hopefully are delicious food to eat.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
this notion of a kind of recipe or a set of instructions is something which is shared both in terms of building codes, planning codes, as well as computational codes. Developing a fluency and a familiarity with this is really important. As you probably know, and as I remember you knowing, coding is a practice. It's something you do. It's much like riding a bicycle or speaking a foreign
Hmm.
language, right?
Hmm.
You do it and you do it again and you do it again. And by practicing it, you get better at it. You develop a familiarity with it. When you stop doing it, you start to forget it, right? And then,
Yeah. Yeah.
it takes a little while to pick up again. But as a practice, it's one which I think, given what we were talking about before with, some of these platforms and technologies becoming increasingly
Hmm.
accessible to people, it's a practice which is more, engages broader and broader sectors of the population. And that's critical. That's really important. It's indeed, it's the language of our time.
So, do you imagine these people or these researchers, practitioners, to be able to ignite new notions in terms of technology, or they're just like looking to be able to communicate with technologists or have great conversations with them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's there's a range of different levels of engagement, is the way I like to describe it.
Uh-huh.
I think as an architect, as an urban designer, as a planner, we probably aren't going to be the ones who are developing new network architectures for an AI, new neural networks, right?
Mm-hmm.
We might be, applying models and that have been developed, right? So you have a model that's good at, let's say, optimizing a glass surface, right, based on a kind of curvilinear form. We might apply that model. And in some cases, there will be people at lower levels of engagement who are architects and designers, excuse me, who will be writing these code. But generally speaking, what's important is that we establish a kind of common language, right, by which
Uh-huh.
we're able to have communicate. And if anything, this emphasizes the fact that this is a kind of interdisciplinary and collaborative practice. Right? Shaping the built
Mm-hmm.
environment is not the purview of one profession. It takes many different professions, many different expertise, backgrounds, skills, and I think that the importance of being able to understand and write code is so that you can have that conversation. Again, at different levels. Some people will only enter in at a very high level and understand basic principles of, say, data science and how it applies to, say, predictive analytics for designing amenities for an urban public space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where others might actually understand a little bit deeper and be able to deal with the specifics of the importance of de-anonymized data, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how that happens, so that we can make sure that we're able to introduce forms of privacy and protections of personal information in public spaces.
Okay, you've mentioned data, and my next sort of questions regards one of the topics that I know that you've written many pieces about, and it's your area of focus, at least in the last recent years, urban data. Mark, how do you formulate a contemporary perspective toward urban data in terms of the way we generate it in the urban space, or on the other side of equation, the way large corporations use our data? And tell us a little bit about the concerns and the possible opportunities in this.
Yeah, so that's a really big question.
Yeah, and I know.
You know, so and it's an important one. It's really the question when thinking about you know, in particular machine learning and as it's being applied to urban spaces. So you have a couple of examples, a couple of models or references, you know, reference points to look at. You know, probably the most current is a development project happening in Toronto at the moment. It's called Sidewalk Toronto, and this is a partnership between Sidewalk Labs, which is a spin-off or spawn of Alphabet Inc., which is Google's parent company.
Google, yeah.
Yeah, and Sidewalk, together with a public organization called Waterfront Toronto. And they're in the process of developing a small 12-acre site at the eastern edge of Toronto's waterfront called Quayside, in 12 acres. And, you know, the intention originally was to kind of expand this to the entire Portlands area, which is an old, you know, industrial, former industrial area on the waterfront. Much like, you know, you have the Great Lakes in North America where you have these industrial sites along the water, like here in Buffalo, like in Detroit and so forth. And in Toronto, it's no different. So in Toronto, at Quayside, they're developing a new city from the ground up, at least a kind of prototype city, and it's, you know, mixed use and mixed income, importantly. So a combination of you know, affordable housing with office space and public services and events and so forth. In developing the plans, there has been a substantial pushback in terms of how is it that you have basically a company which is in the business of harvesting and monetizing data, like Alphabet is, you know, using your, you know, mining your web histories and your search histories, for example, and purchasing histories, to sell advertising, to sell greater targeted advertising. The question happens, you know, comes, what happens when that's applied to physical space? Sidewalk Labs introduced a separate category. So, you know, we basically, you know, what we have personal data, personal transactional, what you might call transactional data, and that's data that is captured anytime you know, fill out a form, you purchase something, you know, whether it's through a website, through a mobile phone, or filling out a paper form. This is data which is captured through a particular transaction. Typically, we're aware that it's happening. We agree to the terms by which this data is collected. We understand the parameters. You know, is this data going to be shared? You know, those privacy policies, which nobody ever reads, go into quite detail, you know, specific detail about who and what can access that data and how it can be used. Urban data, on the other hand, is something which is a little bit more difficult. Getting consent is very difficult when you're, for example, you know, you're setting up a CCTV camera at an intersection and trying to measure the flow of pedestrians versus bikes versus cars. You know, giving your consent that, you know, your movements through that intersection, which are generating data points, which in some cases are either optimizing systems, making that traffic flow better at that intersection. In other cases, being sold to real estate companies which want to monetize location data there. They want to know, right, what is the pedestrian and foot traffic. That's, for someone, that's valuable information. The challenge with urban data in that case is that you can't very easily get everyone's consent, right? You know, the data itself, depending upon how you deal with it, can be can be anonymized at the source, meaning, you know, that they can actually, you know, not upload or share the visual information, but you're just dealing with traffic counts or numbers of people versus numbers of bikes versus numbers of dogs, you know, for example. But in other cases, it's not. In other cases, you know, running face detection algorithms on a CCTV stream is trivial these days, right? And, you know, you see what's emerging in China with the Citizen Score platform, you know, a very advanced surveillance apparatus, which is able to track and people's movements and identities as they move throughout the city. There's, you know, a number of interesting news reports, media reports, where you have reporters, you know, going in and you're basically trying out the system in collaboration with the local police departments to just play a game to see how long it takes them to find them. And it's measured in seconds and minutes, the amount of time it takes to track, identify, and locate someone. So urban data has a different set of questions that surround how it's collected, who has access to it, who owns it, how can it be shared, you know, what are the policies that are developed around that data, because it's collected and harvested in different ways, and it has different parameters by which you know, consent, authorization, and privacy, who owns it, you know, are determined.
So you have mentioned that, like many technologies often say, data can be anonymized, and on the other hand can also be de-anonymized. So what do you think? I mean, is there a possible way for designers to engage in this conversation, or this is something outside our hands? It's something we can't participate in conversations and dialogues?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely something we can engage in directly. You know, given even a most basic understanding of how these operations work, there's a lot of research that's going on into just how this de-anonymization works, right? You know, you have one data set, which may be the only, you know, so the personal names, maybe even their addresses are de-anonymized, I mean, are obscured, you know, within a data set of, let's say, health information, right? There's studies have shown that you can, you know, even with something as simple as a zip code, which is a postal code for where you live, your gender, and let's say age, right? These three data points, when matched with another data set, say having to do with trash collection or something, or purchasing histories, can very, very easily be used to identify people. Another example would be there was a study with taxi cab medallions in New York City. They were using the mobility patterns of New York City taxis to identify certain trends in the city in terms of where people were moving and what they were doing. And they were saying, oh, well, you know, don't worry, it's all private, you know, the data itself is anonymized, which meant that they took the actual medallion number, which had a certain form, and hashed it using an MD5 hash, which, you know, if you know that there's like a certain logic to the way those numbers in this work in the first place, regardless of what you do with the hash, you're still going to be able to kind of, you know, reverse it, right? So depending upon what level of knowledge that you have, you can always, as a designer, you know, even if you don't know the kind of lower level technologies in place, you can know enough to know what you should be careful not to do, right? There are certain things which, you know, simply, so there's an initiative called privacy by design. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Okay, so this is a European initiative, and it's basically you're looking at principles by which you can kind of design privacy compliant systems. This is a big topic of conversation today in terms of the coronavirus and how we're dealing with a situation where the need for contact tracing, identifying where you've been, understanding your mobility patterns in relationship to other people, and the ability to identify somebody who's contracted the virus and being able to track them and identify people who have been in close proximity to that person for a period of time so that they can be warned that they should get themselves checked as well. Right? We all have a shared interest in defining that, but you can do that in a number of different ways, right? The Israelis are doing it in ways which involve cell phone GPS location data, right? And this is a kind of trove of data which they've had for quite a while. Whereas, you have others who are trying to do it using Bluetooth proximity information. So you're not keeping geographic coordinates, latitude and longitudes, or even where you are in space, but it just keeps a record of where, like what other mobile phones you've been in proximity to, because the Bluetooth specification will reveal, you're basically the ID of the phone, right? Second thing is where's that data stored? By making sure it's stored locally on the device rather than uploaded to a central server, there are certain privacy affordances that are provided that way. So you being able to understand principles of technical design is not something that's outside the purview of a designer. It's design thinking at the end of the day, designing these systems. And these systems are not just technologies. They're people, they're physical spaces, they're interactions over time, and within specific environments. And those are things as architects, as designers, we're trained to understand, right? At a kind of almost an ecological level, right? The ecosystem of people, code, space, information. That's something we should by nature be able to understand the relationships with, even if we don't understand the finer points of hashing a particular variable.
Interesting. So we're speaking about big data being generated, and I know that the key to AI is data, actually. So there is this notion of AI solutionism, which is saying that given enough data to a computer code or computer algorithm, it's capable of solving almost every human problem. So Mark, if we eventually start solving our complex human problems with AI, what happens to the discipline of design? What do you think about that?
Well, there are two questions there. The first one is, what happens when, if you're a hammer, everything becomes a nail, right? And so from the point of view of the hammer, everything becomes a nail. I would first push back on the notion that every human problem can be solved by throwing enough data at it and, enough compute cycles, right? For two reasons. The first is what about those things which are hard to quantify, right? What about those things which fall outside of the measurable in computational terms? For a machine, for example, things, for example, which don't have a high monetary value. We know that the data that gets collected tends to be the data that can be sold somewhere, right? Or the data that has a particular purpose in terms of, let's say, surveillance, law enforcement, security, national interest, right? What about data that, for example, how long I spend staring out my window looking at clouds? What about data having to do with how to get lost in a city? These kinds of things don't really have much value to anyone, and so therefore probably aren't going to be collected, but may have an impact in terms of public health, for example, right? So there's aspects which resist quantification and the conversion into discrete data that can be used to perform a particular function, right? That's the first step, right? So there's things outside of data. The flip side of that is that, when everything becomes a nail to the hammer, you have to ask, to what extent are your future behaviors, the way you're acting, interacting within, say, throughout the course of your daily life, starting to become determined by this data? How does you being viewed as a data point inform the way you see yourself? And I think there's a, popular media has examples. I don't know if you've watched this series Black Mirror, but there's a very famous episode, Nosedive, where it deals with the kind of star economy, this notion of social capital and the reputational economy, where your reputation and maintaining how we change the way we act and interact, with and through these social media platforms to increase our standing within these platforms. So that's one thing. The other side of it is like how data and being rendered as a data point changes the way we think about ourselves. The next question then, you had is in terms of design, right?
And how design evolves in
yeah, and I think that is really the kind of most interesting challenge, right? Is that is it a situation where we get better at designing systems to be careful or be aware of what they can't constrain? How do we build in gaps? How do we build in or design in say black holes into these system things? How do we create sanctuaries for those things which we want to make sure we protect and we don't want to lose, right? As a kind of affordances that, say, a city might offer. How do we design in those spaces which aren't easily convertible into a sort of monetized product to a prediction product sold on a market, right? For example, how do we build into these systems, ways to, opt out? And in the event where we can't, how do we develop forms of resistance against just saying no to the increasing datafication of cities and of urban life within cities, right? One can say no. One can just say no. But it's never, it's the universalism, I think, the bigger question, that you started with, what happens when this kind of AI solutionism, all problems can be solved by AI, I think is the thing you need to push back against, right? There are some things that AI is going to be really, and is really good at, right? We need to, to the extent that it can help us better anticipate hospital resources in, ICU units for treating people with the coronavirus. That's something we really need to kind of, invest in and celebrate and find ways to help. The degree to which AI can be used to differentiate, say, fake news from, actual news sources, right, is something that we should explore. We have to recognize that, though, at the end of the day, especially with fake news, nothing will replace your ability, yourself, to differentiate between what is true, what is actual versus what is fake, right? So understanding that they're pushing back against a notion of a sort of a total approach, a kind of universalist approach, I think is an important thing to recognize as a designer.
Okay, so yeah, you're seeing actually AI not being able to handle design problems, at least in the near future. This is something you're suggesting, yes?
No, I'm not saying it can't handle design problems. I think it does handle design problems already.
Okay.
And I think we see it, and there are people, even looking at, with, I don't know if you're familiar with this company called WeWork. So WeWork employs
it's a co-working space company, I guess.
Yeah. And so what they do is they employ AI in the terms of the layout of,
Oh,
their office spaces. They
oh,
use it
okay.
to take a kind of floor plan and a template and a layout and determine what are the kind of optimal organizations between corridor versus rooms which have access to light and fresh air and things like that. Um, David Benjamin is an architect who directs an office called The Living, and they did a office for Autodesk Systems, which is the makers of AutoCAD, which is a popular CAD software used by many architects. And their offices, what they did is they used it to map and develop the office space layout, starting off by identifying a set of criteria for what people in the office wanted out of their workspace, whether it had to do with proximity to a printer or ability to speak face to face,
Uh-huh.
distances between different kinds of work groups,
Uh-huh.
ratios between private enclosed spaces versus more shared workspaces, and developed a model to begin to play out a set of configurations, office layouts um, based on these criteria and these design criteria, and generating a whole series of solutions, what's called a solution space, so that they can then select and pick from it. But in this case, it's important to remember that it's not a kind of complete and total universal system, right? What they're doing is employing AI in very specific ways at moments
Mhm.
within the design process to help solve problems, right, would be much more difficult to do, just manually. Right?
Then you're envisioning actually artificial intelligence as a, let's say, toolbar, as a tool or instrument in the toolbox of a designer.
Oh yeah,
And yeah,
yeah,
okay.
absolutely, yeah, and it is. I mean, and there are people doing it in different ways. I mean, another project by the Living was they did a facade for Princeton University. It was kind of
Hmm.
it's for their experimental fabrication laboratory, which was
Hmm.
so it's maybe has less of a kind of functional, but more of a kind of symbolic or aesthetic
Oh, yeah.
application. But it had to do with working with the wood facade, the exterior wood sheathing, these boards, and using machine vision to essentially identify locations within a plank of wood where you have a knot, right? A knot is an imperfection in the wood, and then mapping those for each board and then sending that through, I think it was a sandblaster, which enabled them to blast out and manipulate those particular locations in those wood planks. Now, and it's the result is absolutely beautiful and highly textured, but not something you would probably do at that scale without using without a model, in this case trained, a machine vision model trained on how to
Hmm.
recognize a wood knot in a piece of wood. So I guess what I'm saying is that yes, they're definitely there. It's definitely people are experimenting with different ways, but again, it's like we are a long way, if ever, from the place where we're going to just input a set of criteria, hit a button, and the next thing you know, it's going to go through this process. The kind of design constraints are considered, the site constraints are considered, and then it's kind of connects to the fabrication module, and the next thing you know, this house is 3D printed for you.
Hmm.
I'm not quite sure I'd even want a world like that. And I think that's the one thing that is maybe really important to kind of highlight, is that yes, as architects and designers, as artists, we're I don't know, we have the opportunity. We're at a moment where we can actually shape what's developed in terms of the technology. It's
Hmm.
it's in terms of engineers that I work with in the kind of research capacity are always interested in understanding what are different applications, right? They don't care sometimes what the application is. They just want a problem to solve, right? So
Hmm.
that's why sometimes I say, as an architect, as a designer, as an artist, your problem is not to solve problems. right? Your challenge is to create problems for other people to solve, right? And in this case, what role do you want AI to play in design and design professions is the question we need to be asking ourselves, right? So that we can work with people in the business of making these technologies to make them better, to make them privacy compliant, to make them open, accessible, right? To make them equitable, right? To make them fair, right? Bias in computational systems is a whole world of research that people are focusing on, and how AI can be discriminatory and biased in nature, right? So these are things as designers we can ask for, even if we
So
don't know.
you're,
Go ahead.
go ahead, go ahead, you go ahead.
Just to finish, even if we don't know how to do the math.
Okay, so what you're suggesting is actually the designer's perspective about AI is pretty much defining the future of AI in the discipline of design.
I'm saying
I
that's
mean,
a proactive role we can take.
okay,
Yeah.
great.
And
You go ahead.
that's it.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, super interesting, a very enlightening and interesting conversation. We are actually 40 minutes in our the second part of the conversation, and I have to ask the last question, which is a little different. I know, Mark, you're in between of your classes, and my last question is pretty much, yeah, thank you for that, really, seriously. And the last question is pretty much about what you're doing in the university. You've been teaching technology to the graduate students for many years, and I'm just curious to hear from you. And how do you start teaching technology, let's say teaching graduate student about AI, and what is the challenge of this, and I'm just curious to hear about your experience.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I'm doing a course this spring, which is machine learning for media artists, right? So it's titled
Okay.
"Making Media with Machine Learning," and this is for people who don't know anything really about. So what's happening with machine learning, which is a subset of AI, is what happened to Arduino when I first started teaching 15 years ago. And it's that it's becoming accessible to artists now in ways that it wasn't even just a year or two ago. The key is to get people engaged, right? You have to introduce the high-level concepts so they understand what's going on. But you got to put them in a situation where you can kind of tinker, where you can poke around, you can try and experiment, with, say, a model that's, good at, object detection. And, what is somebody who doesn't know anything about machine learning going to do with an object detection model? Well, one of the things, we had a student who the first thing he wanted to do was find out what images would confuse the model, not which would make the model work well, but what type of image. So say there was a machine object detection model, machine learning model, which was good at recognizing horses, right? Versus people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you could feed it an image of a horse and it would say, okay, this is a horse. You can feed it an image of a person and it says, okay, this is a person, right? Pretty dumb and boring. But what was interesting is, the research that this guy did was to start to look at you familiar with the centaur?
No.
That's a half man, half horse.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So this presented
Yeah.
problems for the
So
model, right? And so it entered into this whole kind of investigation
even for
where
me, I guess.
for us too, right? So it's the question of these boundary objects, right? And boundary
Yeah.
objects are objects which share properties of both categories, and opens up this question about categorization, and enabled this person to have a kind of intellectual engagement with what they were learning, which didn't have to do with solving problems, but had to do with kind of exploring and trying to understand what is, being curious. You know, you need to develop a curiosity about these things. How do you become curious about them, and how does that lead to you know, the drive to learn more, basically?
Great, Mark. Thank you so much for being in this live conversation. It's really wonderful. It was, and we are really privileged to have you. And
Well, thank you.
Go
Thank you so
ahead.
much for the invitation. It's lovely to see you.
No,
I
yeah. It was great. It was a great experience.
Yes. Okay. Take care. Good luck, and
Yeah.
stay healthy. Wash your hands.
Thank you. I use my hand sanitizer.
Ah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Have a great day, Mark. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.